You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome, everyone, to a webinar entitled Finding God in Space Exploration and Extraterrestrial Life, with presenters Paul Segura and Ted Peters. My name is Sebastian Mofford, and I am the director of ITEST. The Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, ITEST, is an association of theologians, scientists, and others committed to a Catholic worldview in which faith and science collaborate in exploring the truth. ITEST explores truth theologically in the wisdom traditions of the human community and in the data studied in the sciences. ITEST's mission is to foster and disseminate the Catholic position that science and faith in God are complementary paths to human fulfillment. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to welcome Dr. Cynthia Tulin-Wilson, who will open us in prayer. Dr. Tulin-Wilson is a lifelong New Englander. Born and bred in Rhode Island, she frequently returns to Bristol to enjoy fried seafood and Dell's frozen lemonade near the bay. She now works for Pontifex University and teaches online at Holy Apostles College and Seminary and the Avila Institute. She lives in Vermont. Cynthia?
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
And now I'm delighted to introduce our first presenter. Paul Segura is an aerospace engineer and historian with 35 years in leadership, systems engineering, design engineering, and history roles, plus voluntary roles in the Hazelwood Historic Preservation and St. Louis County Historic Buildings Commissions, the Mound City Archaeological and Missouri Aviation Historical Societies, and ministries including RCIA at parish and archdiocesan levels. Paul holds a BS in Engineering Mechanics from the University of Missouri, Rolla, an MS in Engineering and Policy from Washington University in St. Louis, and a Catechism of the Catholic Church certificate from the Paul VI Pontifical Institute in the Archdiocese of St. Louis. Paul is married to Lynn and has 2 married daughters and 2 grandchildren. Paul's presentation is titled Apollo 8, Providential Mission to the Moon. Paul, take it away.
Well, thank you, Sebastian, and greetings, everybody. It's an honor here to be presenting to everyone about this topic on Apollo 8, Providential Mission to the Moon. So just a little bit more about me. Who's Paul? So as Sebastian mentioned, 35 years in the aerospace industry. I've been married for 30 years. I've been a father for 27 years. Involved in many ministries in the church, but my main one is RCIA, and I've been at that for 25 years. And in terms of the different historical activities, projects, presentations, I've been doing that for 20 years. So this is just an overall agenda of what we will be talking about here today. We'll kind of start off, and also at the end with a little reflection from the Catechism about divine providence to put all of this within that context. And then we'll kind of talk through the historical context of when Apollo 8 happened. And then we'll get into the actual Apollo program, which was the project to go to the moon, and the history of that, and then the actual mission itself. And then we'll close out with the legacy of the mission. And then, of course, that's, as I mentioned earlier, a reflection on divine providence. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church tells us in paragraph 302 a bit about divine providence. So I'll just briefly read this and ask you all to just reflect a little bit upon these words tell us about God and his providence. Creation has its own goodness and proper perfection, but it did not spring forth complete from the hands of the Creator. The universe was created in a state of journeying toward an ultimate perfection yet to be attained, to which God has destined it. We call divine providence the dispositions by which God guides his creation towards this perfection. By his providence, God protects and governs all things which he has made, reaching mightily from one end of the earth to the other, and ordering all things well. For all are open and laid bare to his eyes, even those things which are yet to come into existence through the free action of creatures. So the space program, the beginnings of the space program, and this Apollo 8 mission all took place in the historical context of the Cold War, which starting after the end of World War II was a great military and economic competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. At times where it was fought as hot wars or proxy wars as well. So again, within the context of the Cold War, the space race itself began, and the space race began in October 4th, precisely in 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, which was the very first satellite, artificial satellite, to be launched off the Earth and attain orbit around the Earth. This event triggered the space race. There was expectation within the United States at that time that the United States was far ahead of the Soviet Union in science and technology. So the fact that the Soviet Union did this before the United States was an immense shock to the nation. Created a lot of anxiety and fear by many people in the United States as to what the Soviets could do with this new technology against the United States. So as a result of this, Congress passed and the President Eisenhower signed a new law forming the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. It came into being on the 29th of July in 1958. NASA was handed the mission to immediately put a satellite into orbit for the United States. It took a little while for that to happen, but eventually did. Beyond that, the next major goal that the United States wanted to do was to place a person into space, or an astronaut into space. And that was done through the Mercury program that NASA formulated. And the spacecraft Freedom 7 was launched with Alan Shepard as the first American to fly into space on the 5th of May in 1961. Now, although that was an enormous achievement for the United States, unfortunately, the Soviet Union had launched their first person into space, a cosmonaut named Yuri Gagarin, just a few weeks before that. So once again, it was displayed to the world that the United States remained behind the Soviet Union. In light of all this, the relatively newly elected president of the United States, John F. Kennedy, asked NASA, what is it in terms of these space technologies and these space events where the United States could beat the Soviets into space? And after a lot of analysis, NASA told President Kennedy that we would not be able to beat the Soviet Union with the next several major milestones to get into space, sending 2 people into space, sending multiple spacecraft into space. The Soviets were ahead by years. But landing a person on the moon is far enough into the future that NASA thought that we could catch up by that time. So as a result of NASA telling that to the president, President Kennedy then called for a joint session of Congress on the 25th of May in 1961, just shortly after Alan Shepard's first flight, where he called for landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth by the end of the 1960s, thereby setting the stage for the race to the moon. So just 7 short years after President Kennedy set that challenge for the United States, in the year of 1968, the world had changed from what it was in 1961. And a lot of that change, some was positive, but a lot of that change was not. The United States found itself very divided in 1968, more divided than it was since the Civil War, almost a century beforehand. And this is just a summary of what happened in 1968, just to kind of give a flavor of this division that took place. So one of those hot wars, proxy wars, that I mentioned earlier in the Cold War was the Vietnam War. The United States was deeply involved in that war. And in 1968, the Tet Offensive took place, where the North Vietnamese, who we were fighting against, had a surprise attack against the South Vietnamese, who we were supporting. So that was a big shock. President Lyndon B. Johnson was in his first term of office as president of the United States. 1968 was an election year. He was due for re-election. And because of the issues of division in the United States, a lot of it driven by the war in Vietnam, President Johnson shocked the nation by announcing he would not run for a second term. The civil rights icon, Dr. Martin Luther King, was assassinated in 1968. That triggered several riots throughout cities in the United States, including Washington, D.C., Chicago, Kansas City, New York, etc. Robert F. Kennedy, who was a Democratic candidate for president that year, he was assassinated as well in California. Protests against the Vietnam War took place in multiple colleges and university campuses across the country. This was the year also that Pope St. Paul VI promulgated the encyclical Humanae Vitae. Also, 1968 is when the Warsaw Pact, which was basically the countries that were under the influence of the Soviet Union, invaded Czechoslovakia, crushing the Prague Spring, which was a freedom movement in Czechoslovakia at that time. Also, France conducted its first hydrogen bomb test, spreading the amount of nations on the earth who had nuclear weapon capability. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, there were a lot of riots that took place in the streets with protesters against the war and other demonstrators. This was all shown on live national TV. The Mexican government crushed this Mexican movement of 1968, Movimiento Estudiante, just before the opening of the Olympic Games that was held in Mexico City. In 1968, Richard M. Nixon won the presidential election, was elected the 38th president of the United States. Mao Zedong started the Up to the Mountains and Down to the Villages campaign, which is a re-education movement for educated youth in China. The Khmer Rouge was eventually formed in 1968 in Cambodia, which in years later would be responsible for genocide and other atrocities. And in 1968, there were multiple airplane crashes and hijackings that took place. So I just put on here a quote from the early church father Origen: where there is division, there is sin. So I mentioned that NASA was charged with the responsibility to come up with a plan to beat the Soviets in the space race, and that plan was decided to be a mission to land an astronaut on the moon. That mission became Project Apollo. So what you see here is the overall flight plan of how NASA planned to get astronauts to the moon and land on the moon. There's a number of different approaches to take. The approach that was decided upon, or the mode, was called lunar orbit rendezvous, in which a single rocket was launched off of the Earth. That single rocket would bring two types of spacecraft to the moon, a mothership and a lander. Once reaching the moon, the lander would separate from the mothership, land on the moon. Astronauts would then walk on the moon, return to the lander, launch off the moon with the lander, return to the mothership. The lander would remain on the moon in lunar orbit, and then the mothership would return to Earth. So at a high level, that is the flight plan for getting to and landing on the moon. How they were going to do that was with the Saturn V rocket, which was that single rocket that would launch these spacecraft into space towards the moon. Saturn V was the largest rocket ever designed. It was only just last year when NASA launched the brand new rocket called Artemis that actually became the largest rocket and beat the Saturn V's record. But of course, back in the 1960s, the Saturn V at 7.5 million pounds of thrust, 363 feet tall, was the largest rocket by far. The spacecraft that it was carrying, they were launched into space, is what you see in the middle. The command module is the capsule where the crew of 3 astronauts would travel to the moon. Connected to the command module is the service module, which contains all of the fuel, the oxygen, the power, other equipment as well, plus the large engine, which you see the bell of the engine connected to the back of that would power them into lunar orbit and get them out of lunar orbit. Okay. And then to the right of the command module is this more spidery looking spacecraft. That's the lander I mentioned earlier, and it's called the lunar module. Okay, so that lunar module would be connected or docked to the command module. 2 astronauts would go into the lunar module. 1 astronaut would remain in the command module in lunar orbit. The 2 in the lunar module would go down to the lunar surface, land, as shown on the bottom there. 2 astronauts would then get out of that, walk on the moon, return to that lunar module, launch, go back into lunar orbit, dock again with the command module, and join that 3rd astronaut, and then return to Earth. So that is the approach that the Apollo program is taking to get to the moon. So, of course, to get to the moon, it's just not build a rocket and try once, right? There's a series of tests and approaches that need to be taken in order to verify that all of the spacecraft, the rocket, and the equipment are ready. So this flight schedule shows these test flights and the step-by-step approach to get to the moon. So Apollo 4 and Apollo 6 were unmanned, no astronauts on board. They were tests of the Saturn V rocket itself with the command service module attached to make sure that the rocket would function properly. It could launch the CSM into Earth orbit and launch it toward the moon. Apollo 7 would be the first crewed test of the command service module. A smaller rocket would launch that into Earth orbit just to make sure that the command module and the service module would operate properly in space. Apollo 5 was an unmanned test of the lunar module. Okay, so that lunar module test took place in January of 1968, and overall that looked pretty good. Okay, the Apollo 7 flight test of the command module was scheduled for later in the year, in October of 1968. Apollo 4 and Apollo 6 took place earlier. Apollo 4 in November of 1967 and Apollo 6 in April of 1968. And then Apollo 8 was designed to be a test of all of the spacecraft together now in low Earth orbit to make sure that the command module, service module, and the lunar module all were operating to expectations. That was planned for December of 1968. Then Apollo 9 would take that same collection of spacecraft and test that in high Earth orbit. That was scheduled for February of 1969. And then Apollo 10 will be the first mission that would actually go to the moon with all of the spacecraft. It would not land on the moon, but it would test those spacecraft in lunar orbit. And the thought was that Apollo 11 in late 1969 would be the first attempt to actually land on the moon. So this was the schedule that was put forward and what NASA was working to in order to get to that lunar landing. Now, that Apollo 6 launch, that second unmanned test of the large Saturn V rocket, took place in April of 1968. The earlier test, Apollo 4, that was in 1967, went really well and gave everybody high confidence that the Saturn V rocket was ready. But in the second test, there were a number of problems that took place. There were vibrations that took place caused by pogo oscillation in the rocket during launch that caused some damage to the rocket. And as the rocket continued into space, there were several engines that shut down. So there were concerns about the rocket really being ready and if there were changes that needed to be made to the rocket. Also, there's a picture on the right here of the lunar module. This is actually the lunar module from Apollo 11. But the lunar module that was supposed to be used for the Apollo 8 test in Earth orbit was running way behind schedule. Although they did the unmanned test earlier in the year, the test of the manned version had several changes in it that were not ready. So this was causing a problem with NASA trying to keep up with the flight schedule. In addition to these problems that NASA was having, the CIA approached NASA with some information and intelligence about what they were finding out with the Soviet space program. Secret satellite photos showed an enormous rocket at Baikonur, which was the space launch complex for the Soviets, that this large rocket was definitely of the size that would be able to send astronauts to the moon. And they were getting a lot of intelligence chatter or a lot of just, hearing of conversations back and forth that there's the possibility, not known for sure, but a possibility that the Soviets were planning a manned orbital flight around the moon, not to land on the moon, but to at least send astronauts to the moon in orbit around the moon in late 1968. Now, that would not land on the moon, so would not meet the goal of President Kennedy, but it would be a serious threat, and the Soviets could claim that they beat the United States to the moon by orbiting before we would. And if you may recall, on the flight schedule, we weren't planning a mission to orbit the moon until mid-1969. So this became a big concern of, if it is true that the Soviets are planning a late mission to orbit the moon in late 1968, that would be ahead of when NASA was going. And to further put pressure on this whole situation, the Soviets did launch in September of 1968, the Zond 5 mission, which was an unmanned mission, but it did carry animals. Okay, and this mission was designed to launch towards the moon, circle around the moon, and return to Earth. And this mission did successfully do that. It was the first spacecraft ever to be launched from Earth to the moon and return from the moon and land on the Earth. Carrying, several animals, including a couple of tortoises here. Okay, so the result of these problems that NASA was having, and then the CIA intelligence, and the possible threat coming from the Soviets of beating them to lunar orbit, was forcing NASA into a big decision that needed to be made. Apollo 10, that first flight to the moon, was not scheduled until the summer of 1969. That would be later than what the Soviets were apparently trying to do in late 1968. The lunar module for Apollo 8, as mentioned, was not going to be ready for that test flight because of the delays of getting the lunar module ready. The Soviets may be ready to send a manned mission to fly by the moon, at least, before the end of 1968, and that successful Zond 5 flight increased the pressure on the United States and NASA in particular, and it really made it look like, well, NASA must be really behind if this is where the Soviets are really at. So George Low, who was the manager of the Apollo spacecraft program office, came up with the idea of changing Apollo 8's mission. Instead of it being the high Earth orbit test of all three spacecraft, sending just the command and service module on a mission to orbit the moon. The lunar module is not ready anyway, so we don't need it for that kind of mission. So this would possibly keep the program on track and maybe even accelerate the flight schedule and potentially beat the Russians to at least orbit the moon. Now, this is a very daring and risky plan to do that. And one of the big risks is if you change the flight plan and not change the dates of when this is going to be launched, that really squeezes the preparation time from 18 months to 4 months, which is obviously a big risk. Dr. Werner von Braun, he was the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, which led the Saturn V design team. They were working on the problems that they saw with Apollo 6, and they were confident that the design changes would fix those vibration problems and engine shutdown problems, and the other issues that they saw with Apollo 6. So he indicated that the Saturn V would be ready to carry astronauts successfully and safely. So the final decision of whether or not they would make this change to Apollo 8's flight mission would be contingent upon Apollo 7's mission. And if you recall, Apollo 7 will be the first flight of the command module and the service module in Earth orbit. If that mission went well, showing that the command and service modules were ready for space flight and would behave as expected, then NASA would go ahead with the plan to change Apollo 8's mission to go to the moon instead of being a high Earth orbit test. So this was presented to NASA Administrator James Webb, who, after a lot of coordination and answering questions of concerns about the risks, eventually did approve this plan, which he took to President Johnson, and President Johnson approved the plan. So in October of 1968, Apollo 7 launched, and they did have a successful flight of the command and service modules. They both performed beautifully, as fully expected, only minor issues that were easily addressed. So as a result of that successful flight, NASA did go forward with the change of Apollo 8's mission to fly to the moon itself. Now, the original crew that was going to fly Apollo 8 was asked, well, hey, we're going to change the mission to go to the moon instead of high Earth orbit. They chose not to do that. They didn't feel comfortable with that change. So NASA asked the Apollo 9 crew, would you be interested in flying this changed Apollo 8 mission to the moon? And they said, yes, we would love to do that. So the two crews swapped positions, okay? And that new Apollo 8 crew would have to live with that shortened preparation time. High stress. It's already high stress to prepare for missions into any part of space, but to have a lot less time with this change was even more stress. So this is how the flight schedule was modified as a result of all these decisions. So you see there the Apollo 7 mission, that was a success, okay? That took place. It actually flew in October of 1968. So Apollo 8 would now be changed to fly the command and service modules to the moon to orbit the moon. Okay, that would launch and be ready by December of 1968. Okay, Apollo 9, okay, their mission was changed to be a low Earth orbit test of all three spacecraft in Earth orbit. Okay, the high Earth orbit test would be canceled. If Apollo 8 went well, going all the way to the moon, they wouldn't need a high Earth orbit test. Okay, Apollo 10, that flight plan was not changed, but the flight was moved up to May of 1969, and then Apollo 11, which would be the first attempt to land on the moon, was moved up from late 1969 to the summer of 1969. So as a result of all these changes that took place, this is how the Apollo 8 changed flight plan, the new flight plan looked. It looks somewhat similar to what we saw earlier of the description of the Apollo flight plan. The only difference would be there would be no landing of the lunar module or the landing craft on the moon. Okay, but all other aspects of the flight plan would remain the same. They would leave Earth, fly to the moon, orbit the moon, fly back to Earth. Okay, and you may have noticed this in the other slide that showed the flight plan, that a flight path to the moon has this crossing flight path to it that kind of looks like an 8. Okay, so one of the crew members decided to incorporate that into their mission patch, which you see in the upper right-hand corner, that would represent their mission. So here is that crew that ended up swapping, okay, and then becoming the Apollo 8 crew. The commander was Frank Borman. He was a colonel in the United States Air Force. He graduated in 1950 from West Point. He was married to Susan, had 2 children, was an Episcopalian. Jim Lovell, who was the command module pilot. He was a captain in the U.S. Navy, graduated in 1952 from the Naval Academy. He was a Navy test pilot, married to Marilyn, 4 children, Episcopalian. Bill Anders was the lunar module pilot. Now, of course, there would be no lunar module on this mission. So Bill Anders would assist with flying the command module and be responsible for a lot of the photography that would take place on this mission. He was a major in the United States Air Force. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1955. He was not a test pilot like the other 2, but was a fighter pilot. But the fact that he had a graduate degree as well is what gave him the ability to become an astronaut. Married to Valerie. He had 6 children in all. He didn't have all 6 children at this time, but he ended up having 6 children. He was Catholic. So Apollo 8 launched on the 21st of December of 1968. And if you may recall off the flight plan slide, this flight was scheduled for December. The reason it was scheduled for December, number one, is because they wanted to try to beat the Soviets, but also because in December would be the launch window to try to take pictures of the near side of the moon. Okay, that would be in daylight. They had to launch in the last week of December so that it would be daylight on the near side of the moon. So they would be in space at the moon during Christmas. So they did launch on the 21st of December. A number of firsts took place on Apollo 8 as a result of this daring mission that took place. They would be the first humans to fly on the Saturn V rocket. Okay. This big, huge rocket that had 2 test flights, one great, one not so great. And it turned out with their flight, it was great. The rocket had absolutely no problems. They successfully launched and reached Earth orbit. So Houston is where NASA has their mission control, and in Houston, Texas, on the ground. And in mission control, a person called the CAPCON, the capsule communicator, is the only person who's authorized to talk to the crew in space to prevent confusion, right, and keep the communications controlled. The CAPCOM for this mission, for at least large parts of it that we'll be talking about here in this presentation, was Michael Collins. Okay, and he was in the backup crew for Apollo 8. The backup crew always plays the role of the CAPCOM in these missions. So in Earth orbit, they tested the spacecraft, make sure everything was working well, and then they were prepared to fire their 3rd stage engine to launch towards the moon. And that maneuver is called the translunar injection. Okay. And so after they did their tests in Earth orbit, Michael Collins, from Houston said, Apollo 8, you are go for TLI, that translunar injection, which they fired that engine. It fired successfully. It shut off when it was supposed to shut off, and they were successfully going to the moon. They went from 17,000 miles per hour, which was their speed in Earth orbit, okay, and they accelerated up to almost 24,000 miles per hour, okay, to escape Earth's gravity. So when they were given that command for TLI, they were the first humans to be first told you are free to leave Earth orbit, and with a successful firing that engine, they became the first human beings to leave Earth orbit. Okay, they were the first to pass through the Van Allen radiation belts, which earlier in the 1960s were discovered, okay, as a result of satellites that were launched into space. Okay, there were a number of televised broadcasts, okay, that took place on this mission, and so this crew, they were the first to take televised pictures of the Earth, okay, on the way to the moon. And as they approached the moon, they were the first human beings to be captured by the gravitational field of another celestial body, which was our own moon. Now, on the way to the moon, Frank Borman unfortunately suffered from vomiting and some diarrhea, stomach condition that he had. But thankfully, that eased up and he recovered, and it really didn't affect the mission itself. Okay, as they approached the moon, they would execute a maneuver to get into lunar orbit. Okay, and this maneuver is called lunar orbit insertion. Okay, and this would be another one of those firsts. They would be the first humans, okay, to be captured into lunar orbit and to perform this maneuver. Now that service module that's on the back of the command module has this very large engine, just one single engine, and that single engine had to fire, right, in order to execute this maneuver, which it did. Okay. The other first that took place is as they would now enter lunar orbit and go behind the moon, they would be the first human beings to lose contact with the Earth, because radio signals would not be able to reach them on the other side of the moon. Okay, so they would be the first humans to be, quote, alone without communication back with Earth, okay, in history. Okay, so this engine, this maneuver had to take place on the far side of the moon, so they did not have the assistance of mission control to perform this lunar orbit insertion. It was all done by computer. It happened, it was successful, they entered lunar orbit. So they were the first to enter lunar orbit. When they were behind the backside of the moon, they were the first human beings to see the far side of the moon. When we see the moon, we always see the same side, the near side. The moon orbits at a speed at which we always see the same side of the moon as it orbits the Earth. So these three were the first to see that other side of the moon and to take pictures of it. On the right is a picture they took of that far side of the moon. Okay, and when they made that maneuver, okay, they would eventually come out from nighttime, lunar nighttime, to lunar daytime, okay? And they experienced that lunar daytime exactly when the flight plan said it was supposed to happen, okay? And Frank Borman was just in awe that at the exact second that the flight plan said, boom, they saw the daylight, okay, on the moon. And he was awed by all of the human calculators, which were, actual people that did all the math, right? And the scientists, the engineers, the mission planners who did all of the analysis for the flight plan and came up with these numbers. And they got the numbers right down to the second. He was just so impressed with that. And so, yes, they were the first to orbit the moon and the first to see the far side of the moon. So while they were in orbit around the moon, they would orbit the moon 10 times, okay? Frank Borman, he recorded a prayer, okay, during this part of the mission that we played at his Episcopal service that night. Now remember, this mission is happening during Christmas, okay? And this is approaching Christmas Eve here. So I'll read to you here from what the Apollo Flight Journal tells us. So Collins said, Apollo 8 Houston, go ahead, Frank, with your message. Borman says, okay. This is to Rod Rose and the people at St. Christopher's, actually to people everywhere. Give us, O God, the vision which can see thy love in the world in spite of human failure. Give us the faith to trust the goodness in spite of our ignorance and weakness. Give us the knowledge that we may continue to pray with understanding hearts, and show us what each one of us can do to set forth the coming of the day of universal peace. Amen. And then Collins responds, Amen. I just love that he said amen. And then Borman said, I was supposed to lay read tonight, and I couldn't quite make it. And Collins said, Roger, I think they understand. And then on the right here is some of the pictures they took on the near side, okay, the side that faces the Earth, in daylight of some of the proposed landing sites that would be used at later missions. On the fourth orbit, okay, of the moon, up until this point, up until the fourth orbit, the spacecraft was actually pointing its nose down towards the moon so they could take pictures of the surface of the moon. So they could actually see the direction they were going. They were just watching the lunar surface go by. But on the fourth orbit, they executed a maneuver so that they could now point the nose of the spacecraft in the direction that they were orbiting. Okay, so they could take pictures from that perspective. Okay, so as they executed this maneuver, you know, they could go from seeing just the moon, and they started seeing the horizon of the moon, which they knew that would happen. Okay, but then on the edge of the horizon of the moon, they started seeing the Earth appear. Now, surprisingly, that was not something that was in the flight plan. It was not something that they practiced in preparing for this mission. So they were completely surprised by seeing the Earth starting to rise, okay, above the horizon moving and continue to rise. All three astronauts at that point were taking pictures of the lunar surface, but when they saw the moon rising, all three of them started the Earth rising. All three of them took pictures of the Earth. They were just so caught by the surprise. Okay, just the beauty of the moment of seeing the Earth small like that, rising over the moon. So all three had black and white film in their cameras. Bill Anders asked Lovell for color film, which he quickly, switched in his camera, and took this picture that you see on the right, which became known as Earthrise. Now, of course, they couldn't see these pictures because they were all taken on film, and it would only be later, after they returned, that this picture could be seen. But in the moment, and as the astronauts today reflect back on this moment, Frank Borman, has said, there was this beautiful planet, blue with white clouds, kind of brownish pink, that you could clearly distinguish. Terribly isolated with a black background of space. But it was everything that we held dearer, was back there, 240,000 miles away. Our families, our country, everything. And it was Christmas Eve. So it was a very nostalgic moment looking back at the Earth. And then Jim Lovell reflected, in later years, the thought, how insignificant we all are. Everybody ever knew. 5 billion people could be behind my thumb as I put it up. And as he moved his thumb, he could hide the whole Earth behind his thumb. And that was just a poignant moment for him. Now, on the 9th orbit, okay, again, this is still Christmas Eve. On the 9th orbit, NASA had planned a television broadcast, okay? And recognizing that this television broadcast would be live and it would be on Christmas Eve, that many people would be available and want to watch this. So the astronauts were told that this would be the largest television audience of all time would be watching. So when they were still training for the mission, NASA told the astronauts, you're going to be doing this, big, huge, historic broadcast, prepare for it. And they asked NASA, well, what do you want us to say? And all NASA said was, just say something appropriate. And so they couldn't quite figure out what to say. Should we change the words of Jingle Bells and sing, or, we're not, people who are good with words. So they asked their wives, They asked other people. They couldn't come up with anything. So finally, a friend of theirs, they asked that worked at the U.S. Information Agency. They asked that person, and that person asked his wife, and she came up with the idea of, well, it's Christmas Eve. They're in space at the moon. Why not read from the beginning of Genesis? So that was suggested to the astronauts, and they liked that idea. So that's what they did. So during the live television broadcast, at the beginning, they were, showing pictures of the moon, they're describing the moon for everybody. And then after they finished doing that, Bill Anders then said, "We are now approaching lunar sunrise. And for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void. And darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness." And then Jim Lovell continued, "And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, 'Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters.' And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day." And then Frank Borman picked up, "And God said, 'Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear,' and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good." And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth. Now, back in Houston, a number of mission controllers have reflected back in the years that this has happened, saying that no one knew this was what they were going to say. All they knew is that they were told to say something appropriate. And the fact that they were all working on Christmas Eve supporting this mission, and the astronauts read from Genesis completely surprised them and touched many of them. Quite a number of them, were tearing up and crying. Some of them had to leave the mission control room, to recollect themselves. Others, just took pause and prayed in that moment. It was very moving for them. And as many others have said, many of the people who are watching, this live broadcast, of the billion people who watched this live, had similar reactions in many places and were very touched by the fact that this was what was said by the astronauts at this particular time. And for many people, the reading of Genesis is the main memory, the poignant moment they have of this Apollo 8 mission. The fact that, hey, they were at the moon and they did this. So they read Genesis and had this poignant moment, and right away, that was the 9th orbit, right away in the 10th orbit, they had to execute a maneuver to prepare to return to Earth, And that maneuver was a trans-Earth injection, TEI, And again, that single large engine on the service module had to fire in order to accelerate them out of lunar orbit and towards Earth. That one engine had to work. The fact that they did not have the lunar module, and they didn't need it because they didn't land on the moon, but the lunar module could also be used as a lifeboat in case something happened with the service module, if there was a problem with it. And years later in Apollo 13, an accident did happen in space, and they did use the lunar module. Now, Apollo 8 didn't have that luxury. They would have to depend on the service module. So again, that maneuver would happen on the far side of the moon. They would cut off from communication from NASA. It would all have it happened automatically by computer. Okay, so when they lost contact with Houston, Houston was waiting, okay, and watching the clock, and as time approached of when the maneuver was supposed to take place, and they were to merge from the far side and be heading towards the Earth, they started hearing some cracks in the static, signaling, "Oh, okay, I think we're back in communication." And Apollo 8 Houston, okay, Michael Collins was saying, "Apollo 8 Houston, over," and they weren't hearing anything. And then all of a sudden, they hear Jim Lovell say, "Roger, please be informed there is a Santa Claus." Okay, gave everybody a great sense of relief and a little laugh, but they were mostly happy. They were able to get out of lunar orbit and they would return to Earth, which they did. It took them 60 hours to return to Earth, and they re-entered the atmosphere, splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The United States Navy came to pick them up. A ship, USS Yorktown, picked them up. So here you see a picture they took of the Earth on the way back to Earth. Okay. Somewhat similar to Earthrise, but no lunar surface shown there. But you see their spacecraft on the deck of the USS Yorktown, the aircraft carrier. And here you see pictures of Borman, Lovell, and Anders with their first comments after they were plucked out of the ocean and on the aircraft carrier. So now the flight's over. A lot of questions from a lot of reporters. One reporter asked, kind of tongue in cheek, "Is the moon made of green cheese?" And Bill Anders answered, "Nope, it's American cheese." Kind of, pointing towards that competition, right, took place between the Soviets and the Americans. From the concluding mission report, George Low wrote, "Almost without exception, spacecraft systems operated as intended. All temperatures varied in a predictable manner within acceptable limits, and consumable usage was always maintained at safe levels. Communications quality was exceptionally good, and live television was transmitted on 6 occasions. The crew superbly performed the planned mission." So in a nutshell, this high-risk mission went off practically without a hitch. It was extremely successful. And most importantly, the 3 astronauts returned to Earth safely, right? And they reached the moon, the first people to reach the moon. They didn't land on the moon, but they did reach the moon, and they beat the Soviets in doing that. So similar to Alan Shepard when he was the first American in space, and similar to John Glenn when he was the first American to orbit the Earth, these 3 astronauts received a similar reception. There was a ticker tape parade in New York City in their honor. They're invited to visit and speak at the United Nations while in New York. They're invited to speak before a joint meeting of Congress, all 3 of them. President Johnson awarded them the NASA Distinguished Service Medal at the White House. Okay. And then Frank Borman and his family was asked to take a tour of Europe as a goodwill tour as a result of the end of this mission. Okay. And one of the stops they took was at the Vatican. And Pope Paul VI and Frank Borman were discussing the Genesis reading. And Pope Paul said to Frank, for that particular moment of time, the world was at peace when they read that Genesis reading there. Time magazine every year selects a person of the year. Back then, they would select a man of the year because of all of the violence that was happening and the protests that were happening in 1968. Time magazine was planning on making the protester the person or the man of the year. But as a result of the Apollo 8 mission, they changed that and made the Apollo 8 crew the men of the year. Okay. And then the crew received a lot of letters, a lot of postcards, a lot of telegrams, as the years went by. A lot of them they didn't have time to read or do, a lot of them they just didn't remember. But the crew remembered this one, even years later. They received a telegram that said, "Thank you, Apollo 8. You saved 1968. So what's the legacy of this space flight? Well, first of all, it was successful, as George Lowe's mission report said. It achieved all of the objectives it was intended to achieve. Mainly, it was able to prove that you could fly to the moon, orbit the moon, and return safely. And that was so important because the exact same flight path would be needed to land on the moon. So it set a great foundation for Apollo 11. Okay, you see the patch for Apollo 11 here on the right. It set a great foundation for Apollo 11 to follow in their footsteps. They would be able to use the experience of Apollo 8 to fly. So the main thing that Apollo 11 would need to worry about is the actual landing. That would be the first thing that would happen on Apollo 11, which it did obviously successfully, right, in the summer of 1969. But all of the other firsts of Apollo 8, Borman, Lovell, and Anders being the first humans to leave Earth completely, leave Earth orbit completely, and being the first humans to fly to the moon and to orbit the moon, to see the far side of the moon, to see the Earth as it looks from the moon and the impact of that. They were the first to do that. Now, Apollo 11 is most remembered by most people as being the significant mission of landing on the moon. And it was, no question about that. But they were not the first to go to the moon. It was Apollo 8. And that's where these three astronauts hold the history for that. So Jim Lovell, again later, reflecting upon the flight, said, "We often talk about going to heaven when we die, but in reality, don't we go to heaven when we're born? Because don't we arrive on a body that has the proper mass that can contain water in an atmosphere, the very essentials of life? And don't we arrive on a body that's just at the right distance from a star that provides the energy to the Earth? And that energy is what caused life to evolve in the beginning. In some aspects, God has really given us a stage on which to perform. And I think that how this play comes out is really up to us." And Frank Borman years later reflected, "Realizing that we had done our job well, that we beat the Russians to the moon, and there was no doubt in my mind now that the rest of the program was going to work. I had a feeling almost of euphoria. I was so pleased. I was so thankful for, because let's face it, God must have been looking after us or we wouldn't have made it. So it was a very, very, very religious experience for me." United States Post Office decided to take that picture that was taken, that after it was developed, became Earthrise. And right away, it became a very popular photo, which is why the Post Office chose that one for the stamp. And in addition, also placing the words of the beginning of their Genesis reading on this same stamp. Jim Lovell, his quote, he actually said this while they were still in orbit: "The Earth from here is a grand oasis in the big vastness of space." And Bill Anders reflected later, "We came all this way to explore the moon. And the most important thing is that we discovered the Earth." So there's this sense of, we achieved the technical goals of this mission, but this mission also achieved much bigger, broader human and spiritual goals that the planners never even planned on, right? This photo Earthrise has been counted as one of the most 100 significant photos in all of history. And all of it is so famous. And helped launch the environmental movement as well. So that Genesis reading that took place, Madeleine Murray O'Hare ended up challenging and suing NASA for going against separated church and state because of reading from the Bible. It went to the Supreme Court. NASA actually won that case, but because they got into legal trouble, NASA decided to change their policies, that there would no longer be any spiritual type of, religious type of discussion broadcast from space. I mean, the astronauts could talk among themselves, but when it comes to transmissions to the Earth, no more referencing anything religious. So that's why, since Apollo 8, you have not heard anything really religious that has been communicated and broadcast from space. Yet that said, okay, I've just put a couple of thoughts here at the bottom of the slide. It took a trip to the moon to prompt questions about who we are, what does all this mean, and what do we need to do with this knowledge that we learned? That, hey, going to the other box here, for the first time, people saw themselves as inhabitants on a small world in a large universe. For all human history, we were on Earth and thought of just the Earth. I mean, for a long time, we thought that's all there was the Earth. And even after we learned that, there are other planets out there, and we circle the sun and all that, our focus is the Earth. What are our lives on the Earth? And this mission, for the first time, opened our eyes to say, wow, we can see ourselves in the context of who we really are, that we're on this small planet orbiting the sun in this solar system. And what's that say about us? And what's that say about God and about us? And as it was for Frank Borman, for many other people, that opens up a lot of deeper religious questions about our relationships to each other, about our relationships to the Creator. And a last thought here about this mission. As the years went by, the Apollo 8 crew became known as the Original Wives crew. Why is that? Well, most of the Apollo astronauts were married. There's some that weren't, but most were married. And as time went on, as years went by, they were the only crew that stayed married to their original wives. All those other crew members got divorced or remarried or didn't remarry, etc. Frank Borman, who was the commander, he retired as a colonel, remains married to Susan, had those 2 children, has grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Jim Lovell, the command module pilot, retired from the Navy as a captain, remains married to Marilyn, had those 4 children, has many grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Bill Anders, the lunar module pilot, and when he got back from the mission, he was promoted to colonel, okay, but eventually retired from the Air Force as a major general. Remains married to Valerie, eventually had 6 children and has grandchildren as well. So all 3 have large families today. So as I mentioned earlier, I want to circle back now. We kind of had this catechism reflection at the beginning, so I want to close with a catechism reflection on what a couple of other paragraphs say about divine providence and in light of how this mission, Apollo 8, unfolded. To human beings, God even gives the power of freely sharing his providence by entrusting them with the responsibility of subduing the earth and having dominion over it. God thus enables men to be intelligent and free causes in order to complete the work of creation, to perfect its harmony for their own good and that of their neighbors. Though often unconscious collaborators with God's will, they can also enter deliberately into divine plan by their actions, their prayers, and their sufferings. They then fully become God's fellow workers and co-workers for his kingdom. The truth that God is at work in all the actions of his creatures is inseparable from faith in God the Creator. God is the first cause who operates in and through secondary causes. For God is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Far from diminishing the creature's dignity, this truth enhances it. Drawn from nothingness by God's power, wisdom, and goodness, it can do nothing if it is cut off from its origin, for without a creator, the creature vanishes. Still less can a creature attain its ultimate end without the help of God's grace. And here's the sources and some references if you want to dive deeper into this incredible providential mission to the moon. So I thank you for your time today and for listening. Sebastian, back to you.
Thank you, Paul, for your excellent presentation. And now I'm pleased to introduce our second presenter. Ted Peters is a public theologian directing traffic at the intersection of science, religion, and ethics. Peters is an emeritus professor at the Graduate Theological Union, where he co-edits the journal Theology and Science on behalf of the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences in Berkeley, California, United States of America. He just co-edited, I'm going to start that over. And now I'm pleased to introduce our second presenter. Ted Peters is a public theologian directing traffic at the intersection of science, religion, and ethics. Peters is an emeritus professor at the Graduate Theological Union, where he co-edits the journal Theology and Science on behalf of the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences in Berkeley, California. He just co-edited Astrobiology, Science, Ethics, and Public Policy, as well as Astrotheology, Science and Theology Meet Extraterrestrial Intelligence. You can see his blog site at Patheos and his website, Ted's Timely Take. Ted lives with his wife Karen in Berkeley, California. His presentation is entitled Astrotheology, Where Science and Faith Meet ETI, or Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Ted, take it away.
Well, thank you, Sebastian. It's good to be with you and Sheila and the people at ITEST. I congratulate you for the yeoman's work that you're doing in bringing science and faith together. It's so important. The scientific community is almost like a prophet revealing to us the mysteries of nature, and that only expands and deepens our appreciation of God's creation. Important work. Well, our topic here is going to be astrotheology, where science and faith meet ETI, and let's get into it. I come from the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Take a look at the Golden Gate Bridge on our journal cover. It's not yet finished. When it gets finished, we want to see traffic going two ways, one from science into theology and the other from theology back to science. We call it the creative mutual interaction. Astrotheology, what is it? Well, most simply, it's religious reflection on astrobiology. You can see a couple of books here that I've been involved on in preparing. Astrobiology, Science, Ethics, and Public Policy is a collection of essays by space scientists and philosophical ethicists and theological ethicists. And then on the right, a book we put together at the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences, Astrotheology. It includes astrobiologists, to be sure, but also some theologians, mostly Christian, but we have Islamic and Jewish voices being heard here, and we cover a long list of issues that we think need to be addressed. Well, here's a more complicated definition of astrotheology. It is that branch of theology which provides a critical analysis of the contemporary space sciences, combined with an explication of classic doctrines such as creation and eschatology. Why? For the purpose of constructing a comprehensive and meaningful understanding of our human situation within an astonishingly immense cosmos. To the right there, you can see a photograph taken during the first course in astrotheology, which I taught. We in Berkeley mixed together the faculties of the Graduate Theological Union with the faculty at the University of California, Berkeley. So on the right there, my co-professor is Carl Pennypacker, and Carl is an astrophysicist who specializes in dark matter and dark energy. And on the left there is Nate Hallinger, a doctoral graduate student at that particular time, playing the role of the TA. And then in the middle is a guest lecturer coming to us from a planet orbiting Zeta 2 Reticuli, about 29 million light years away. The 4 tasks of astrotheology. The first one, deal with that pesky problem of geocentrism. Is it really the case that religious people think of planet Earth as somehow or other in the center and everything orbits around us? Let's take a look at that one. Incarnation number 2. If we, in fact, share the Milky Way with civilizations, intelligent civilizations on other exoplanets, what's going to happen? Will the story of Jesus Christ on Earth, a single incarnation, apply to the whole cosmos, or will there be a planet-hopping Christ, one incarnation for each and every intelligent civilization? How are we going to handle that one theologically? Number 3, critique the space sciences. Just because scientists are smart doesn't mean we give them a free pass. No. Let's offer an external critique of what goes on within the sciences. And the one I'm going to talk about here is there's a myth, the ETI myth, right in the heart of the sciences. And I think scientists ought to stick to science and not practice theology without a license. So I'll say something about that in a minute. Then astroethics. Space ethics requires public input just so our exploration to off-Earth sites is done with the highest purposes in mind. And we need to prepare planet Earth for possible visits, or at least a relationship being developed with off-Earth societies. So that's where we're going. Pour yourself another cup of coffee and get ready for an adventure in space. The first task, geocentrism. Have you ever heard of the Copernican principle, sometimes called the principle of mediocrity? Well, it goes like this, and watch carefully now and see the sleight of hand as we move from fact to value. It goes like this. The Copernican principle states that the sun, not the earth, occupies the center of the heavens, and that a spinning earth, as well as the other planets, circles around this fiery orb. Okay. That's an astronomical fact, right? Now watch what happens. Next sentence. It is a worldview that asserts that we are not the center of all existence. We are not special. In fact, we are as dull as they come. So the fact that the Earth orbits the sun has a value judgment attached to it, namely, we're dull. Is that good science? I love this cartoon. When are you going to realize that you're not the only being in the universe and the alien has to bring the clean laundry into the messy teenager's bedroom? Well, let's put this issue of the geocentrism into action. And here is Paul Davies, a physicist and astrobiologist at Arizona State University. And he lays down the gauntlet. He makes the challenge. It goes like this. The existence of extraterrestrial intelligences would have a profound impact on religion, shattering completely the traditional perspective on God's relationship with man. If you and I suddenly become pen pals with smart beings on another planet, our religion is going to face a crisis and it will get shattered. That's what Paul Davies thinks. Is this true? I wonder. Well, let's test it. Let's test it by floating a hypothesis, and it goes like this. Official confirmation of the discovery of a civilization of intelligent beings living on another planet would so undercut traditional religious beliefs that the Earth's religious traditions would face a crisis. Can we confirm this or disconfirm it? That's what we're going to do for the next few minutes. What would medieval Roman Catholic theologians think? Well, let's go back to St. Thomas Aquinas, 11th century, professor at the University of Paris, centuries before Copernicus. Well, St. Thomas looked up at the stars and the planets in the sky, and he scratched his head and wondered, I wonder if there are worlds up there like us with intelligent creatures. Well, he concluded, no. It is necessary that all things belong to one world, so there's only one world, the Earth, and the Earth is in the center. He's what you would call a card-carrying geocentrist. But note, did it bother him? Did it make him nervous to ask whether or not an extraterrestrial civilization existed? Not at all. Well, how did he come to this geocentric conclusion? He appealed to Aristotle, the philosopher, and Aristotle had suggested that oneness, centeredness, these things are traits of perfection. And on that basis, he argued that it is necessary that the Earth with its center exhibit the trait of perfection, so there would be one world and not a universe made up of many different competing centers. That was his logic. But note, he doesn't feel there's any crisis going on in offering an honest debate about the issue. 2 generations later, another professor at the University of Paris, John Buridan, he takes up exactly the same question. We're still centuries before Copernicus, and he says, we hold from faith. Oh, just let me interrupt there. So there are 2 forms of revelation, natural revelation and special revelation. Natural revelation is what we learn from the philosophers, what we learn from observing nature, and what we learn from science. And St. Thomas had decided there's only one world on the ground of philosophy. John Buridan, when he uses the word faith, he means what the Bible says, okay? We hold from faith that just as God made this world, so he could make another or several worlds. So it is possible that when we look at the night sky, we're looking at planets that are like Earth, on which there are extraterrestrial civilizations. He thinks the Bible makes this possible. 3 centuries before Copernicus, is John Buridan worried that ETI will spoil his faith? Not in the slightest. What about Roman Catholics today? Well, let's ask them. I conducted the Peters ETI Religious Crisis Survey with one of my graduate students, Julie Freilich, in which we asked 10 questions of self-identified religious people around the world, and Roman Catholics were one of the groups surveyed. Take a look at question 3. Official confirmation of the discovery of a civilization of intelligent beings living on another planet would so undercut my beliefs that my beliefs would face a crisis. Do very many Roman Catholics agree with this? Look at the purple. Only 8% either agree or strongly agree. Only 8%. Look at the blue area. Clearly, Roman Catholics are not worried about a faith crisis for their own beliefs. Now, let's ask a slightly different question, number 4. Official confirmation of the discovery of a civilization of intelligent beings living on another planet would so undercut the beliefs of my particular religious tradition that my religious tradition would face a crisis. So it's not my faith itself that would face a crisis, but I worry about my priest, I worry about the nuns in the parochial school, I worry about my archbishop. And note the purple expands just a little bit to 22%, but still 66%, 2/3 are saying, nah, not a problem. The survey allowed for some comments, and most of the comments look like the ones that you can see right here. One is, the world is too vast and wonderful, and God's power is so limitless that there must be more than little old us. Note, there's no geocentrism here at all, just the opposite. My religious viewpoints and practices would remain unchanged. The same God who made me is also capable of making extraterrestrials. I want to say that is typical of the comments that we got from Roman Catholics in the survey. What about theologians? Theodore Hesburgh, once president of Notre Dame. Catholics can legitimately accept the possibility of life on other planets. Karl Rahner, maybe the most distinguished Roman Catholic theologian of the 20th century. There are in the universe many histories of freedom which do not only take place on Earth. Francis Cannell, former president of Catholic University in Washington. It is good for Catholics to know that the principles of their faith are entirely compatible with the most startling possibilities concerning life on other planets. Pope Francis, after a chapel service recently, maybe a couple of years ago, was asked whether he would baptize an alien, and he said, well, sure, if the alien asks for it. Well, what do you conclude? Are Roman Catholics shaking in their boots, worrying about shattering of faith due to the loss of geocentrism or sharing our cosmos with intelligent space neighbors? I don't think so. What about mainline Protestants? Take a look at questions 3 and 4. Almost the same as the Roman Catholics. Very little purple, clearly predominance of blue. Mainline Protestants aren't going to face a crisis. And taking a look at some of the comments we got from the Protestants, finding ETI, I believe, would be a profound and what wonderful event. And here is my favorite of all the comments. Hey, I'd share a pew with an extraterrestrial any day. Here's Krister Stendahl, former dean of Harvard Divinity School and then later Archbishop of Stockholm in Sweden. And he was invited to a NASA meeting with space scientists, and this issue of ETI came up. He says, that's great. It seems always great to me when God's world gets a little bigger and I get somewhat more a somewhat more true view of my place and my smallness in that universe. Is he a geocentrist? Or does he seem to adopt the principle of mediocrity? Certainly the latter. What about conservative Protestants? And our survey did not discriminate between evangelicals and fundamentalists. They are all mixed in here. I think if I were to do the survey again, I would try to separate out evangelicals and fundamentalists. But here they are together. And questions 3 and 4, almost identical to the Roman Catholics and the other Protestants. Just a tiny little bit of purple and a dominance of blue. Evangelical Protestants don't worry about a crisis. Here are some comments. I think the Bible leaves room for other creatures. You would expect an evangelical to reference the Bible. Both physical and spiritual creatures. If we meet them, then they will probably have a relationship with God as well, although their story may sound different to us. Does that look like geocentrism? I don't think so. How do you like this comment? I don't think they're out there, but if they are, that's cool. Billy Graham, probably the single most prominent evangelical spokesperson of a couple decades ago. I firmly believe there are intelligent beings like us who are far away in space who worship God. Is Billy worried about defending geocentrism? I don't think so. Here's a fundamentalist group, Answers in Genesis, and Answers in Genesis defends creationism against evolution. And this particular online article is responding to a moment that took place at the Royal Society in London. I was sharing the results of my survey there. 2010, I think it was the anniversary of Sir Isaac Newton's, Galileo's telescope. No, it was Isaac Newton. Anyway. And Paul Davies and I had a public debate over the particular issue we're discussing. And so Answers in Genesis decided to get into the debate, and look what they say. The Bible makes no explicit statements as to the existence or non-existence of extraterrestrial life, intelligent or otherwise. So Answers in Genesis, fundamentalist group, it looks like they're not going to have a problem if a flying saucer lands on their church's front lawn and aliens get out and want to attend coffee hour. Buddhism. Take a look at the two questions. There is no purple. Not a single Buddhist respondent thought confirmation of an ETI civilization would be a problem for Buddhist thinking. Here's a comment. To think that in the infinity of the universe that we are the only intelligent life form in existence would be ludicrous. I would only hope those beings would exhibit more wisdom than humans have in how they relate to their world and fellow beings. So there's a hope here, a slim hope, that maybe the extraterrestrials will have something to teach us about human morality. Optimistic, right? Now, there were not enough respondents in Islam for us to think it was statistically measurable. But here's Muzaffar Iqbal writing in our astrotheology book. Praise be to God, the Lord of the worlds might include yet unencountered intelligent beings living somewhere other than the planet Earth. So, Muzaffar, no crisis here. Norbert Samuelson, similarly, we needed a Jewish theologian to comment. Not only would there be a non-problem if we encounter ETI, but that sense of admitting an alien into community reminds him that Jewish people have over the centuries felt alienated from the larger society, and we could forecast maybe something like that might happen again. Now, something is going to get really interesting when we turn to those who identify as non-religious. How are non-religious people going to respond to our questions? Well, here's questions 1 or 2. Questions 3 and 4. I'm non-religious, and so I'm not going to face a crisis. And my other non-religious friends, will they face a crisis? Well, maybe a few of them, but the blue just dominates. Now watch what happens when we add question number 5 about other religions. Oh, wait a minute. Let's get the comments first, then we'll do that. Here are the comments from the non-religious. I remain open-minded, so would not be disturbed by any new findings. Non-religious people, we saw in the comments, frequently describe themselves as open-minded. Maybe they're implying religious people are closed-minded. I'm not sure. Secondly, I hope we do find life beyond our planet. I have an open mind as to what shape it may take and what influence it will have. Then, discovery of ET would not affect my personal belief system because I'm a stone atheist. We did not discriminate in the non-religious category between atheists on the one hand and spiritual but not religious on the other. I think if we were to do the survey again, we would try to separate out those two groups. So the atheist says, I do search for ET and think we will come across some one day. Then finally, the spiritual but non-religious writes, I don't identify with a religious tradition. For those of us whose belief in God is based on experience, extraterrestrial life would only add an interesting theological factor to our theology. Those are the comments. Now, let's get to that question 5. Now, look at this question carefully. Even though my religious or non-religious viewpoint would remain unaffected, contact with extraterrestrials would so undercut traditional beliefs that the world's religions would face a crisis. Look at the purple, 69%. I, not religious, won't have a problem, but all those Stutnagel traditional religious people, they're going to have a crisis. And we've just seen self-identified religious people, no crisis. But the way non-religious people look at religious people is clearly different from the way religious people look at themselves. So that question 5 was asked of everybody, and take a look at the tower. The non-religious people think religious people are going to face a crisis, and maybe that's where Paul Davies gets his warning. So, after the survey, official confirmation of the discovery of a civilization of intelligent beings living on another planet would so undercut traditional religious beliefs that Earth's religious traditions would face a crisis. Is this confirmed by the survey? No. I hesitate to say it's disconfirmed because Paul Davies, a good friend actually, and we just have this debate both in public and private. Paul's counter is, he says, Ted, despite your survey and despite the self-identified religious people say there's no crisis, he says, they don't understand themselves. They don't understand their religious tradition. I say, Paul, how can I test for that? I got some data. You don't have any data other than speculation, and the debate goes on. First, I'd like to thank everyone who believed in me. Well, let's go on to the second task. I'm going to take a little drink of H2O. The Christians are going to have to confront the question of God's redeeming work in Jesus Christ, and the way it's been formulated is, would there be only one incarnation of the second person of the Trinity on planet Earth in the history of Jesus Christ? Or might there be a similar incarnation again and again and again on each planet hosting an extraterrestrial intelligent civilization? Paul Tillich, one of the giant Protestant theologians of the 20th century, is a multiple incarnationist. This is right in volume 2 of his Systematic Theology. If there are non-human worlds in which existential estrangement is not only real, but in which there is also a type of awareness of this estrangement, such worlds cannot be without the operation of saving power within them, not just creation, but salvation. Incarnation is unique for the special group in which it happens, but not unique in the sense that other singular incarnations for other unique worlds are excluded. Let's turn to the Roman Catholics. Here is Thomas O'Meara, Notre Dame theologian. I would call him an exotheologian or an astrotheologian. He also votes for multiple incarnations. As incarnation is an intense form of divine love, will there not be galactic forms of that love? An infinite being of generosity would tend to many incarnations rather than to just one. Incarnations among extraterrestrials would not be competing with us or with each other. Ilia Delio at Villanova. And note in this book, she has a foreword written by John Hott from Georgetown. Both John and Ilia have done a lot of very, very creative work in the interaction between faith and natural science. To speak of Christ on the level of extraterrestrial life is not to restrict the discussion to Jesus, that's the historical Jesus on earth, to Jesus alone, but to see Christ as the icon of created reality. Christ is the divinization of created reality in whatever way the divine word can fully enter into that reality. So Ilia is a multiple incarnationist. My colleague in Berkeley, Bob Russell, founder and director of the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences, is an avid multiple incarnationist. And here is how he argues, and I find his argument really quite forceful. I disagree with it, but here's his argument. There is both a spatial separation between planetary civilizations and a temporal one, with cultures winking into and out of existence without overlapping or intersecting, fading away into God's providence. He's got Albert Einstein's special theory of relativity in the back of his mind here, so that extraterrestrial civilizations at great distance from us are born and die, and there will never be a temporal overlap between theirs and ours. That means missionaries are impossible. You can't send a missionary from Earth in order to catch an extraterrestrial civilization in the middle in order to spread the good news. And so Bob concludes then God's going to have to do it. We can't. The population of multiple incarnations overcomes the time and distance problems, allowing the one God fellowship with creatures whenever and wherever they live throughout the universe. Multiple incarnations. Well, does anybody favor a single incarnation on Earth alone? Yes. Wolfhart Pannenberg, recently deceased, Lutheran theologian at the University of Munich. It is hard to see why the discovery of non-terrestrial intelligent beings would be shattering to Christian teaching. If there were such discoveries, they would, of course, pose the task of defining theologically the relation of such beings to the Logos incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth, the Logos who works throughout the universe. And I have to think here about Genesis chapter 1 and John chapter 1. In chapter 1 of Genesis, God creates all things by the word. And in John chapter 1, that very same creative word becomes incarnate in the historical Jesus Christ, particular time and particular place. You see, I have Logos Sarkos and Logos Asarkos there on the right. So Jesus is Logos Sarkos, the universal Logos in the flesh. But there is a Logos Asarkos, God's creative word, which is powerful everywhere in the cosmos with its 13.7 billion year history and its perhaps 2 trillion galaxies. That divine Logos is present everywhere. The Logos in the flesh, on earth, good enough. But that doesn't mean that God isn't present universally in the second person of the Trinity everywhere in the cosmos. Now, let me just offer you an observation. I think that if you want to emphasize that the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ is for the purposes of revelation, that is to say, to reveal what God eternally is, then you tend to support multiple incarnations. The Holy Spirit has to run around the universe, so to speak, telling everybody God is gracious, God is loving. But if you have a strong soteriology, a strong atonement, wherein the cross and resurrection of Jesus does some work, that it changes the cosmos so that sins are forgiven and the dead are promised resurrection, then I think you would tend towards a single incarnation. And I think that's where Pannenberg fits, and that's where I fit. I love the multiple incarnation humor already. So the alien says to the earthling, oh, he comes back every 2 weeks or so. We gave him this big box of chocolates when he first arrived. Why? Well, what'd you guys do? Oh, yeah, we put him to death on a cross. So let's ask a slightly different question. What's the purpose of the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity? Is it a response to our fall into sin so that a broken creation needs to get fixed? Or is the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ one more step in perfecting the creation? And I think we're going to see theologians falling on two sides. Here's Vladimir Losky, a Russian Orthodox English-speaking theologian. For him, the incarnation is a way of repairing something that's broken. The fall demands a change, not in God's goal, but in his means. For the atonement made necessary by our sins, is not an end, but a means to the only real goal, deification. Karl Rahner, Roman Catholic theologian, on the other hand, would say, no, we would have God's incarnation in Jesus Christ even if there were no fall into sin, even if the creation had not been broken, so to speak. Why? Because God is in the business of self-communicating the divine self with the creation. Okay, we're going to leave task number 2 now and go on to task number 3, and I'm going to take a sip of water. Task number 3, the astrotheologian should make an assessment of the integrity of astrobiology and the other space sciences. Don't give the scientists a free pass. Now, one of the interesting scientific matters over the last 70 years has been the relationship between our established astrobiologists and astronomers and physicists on the one hand, and the UFO community on the other. Many UFO experiencers claim to have had personal encounters with extraterrestrials, but your university and space laboratory scientists don't consider that evidence. It's not evidence. Recently, this has been changing a little bit over the last half dozen years or so. We've got some serious scientific organizations that have cropped up that want to apply scientific standards and instruments to the UFO question. They've slightly changed the nomenclature. Instead of UFO, unidentified flying object, is now UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. I guess that cleans it up a little bit, right? I belong to the SCU, the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. It's an organization I like a lot. It's almost all scientists who are trying to use measurement to analyze films and radar pickups of UAP. I like this group. Many scientists believe in the extraterrestrial hypothesis, even though they do not yet have a proposal on how to test it. At Harvard University, we have the Galileo Project, headed by Avi Loeb, who is an Israeli astronomer. Avi personally believes in the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but the actual experimental work they're doing there is more prosaic, that is to say, using instrumentation for measuring UAP. Let me just say, in my opinion, this is a good move. I really think the UFO phenomenon needs the attention of our scientists. Am I critical here? No, I'm not. Let's go on to the next. Here's where I get critical. There is a myth, I call it the ETI myth, at work within the astrobiological community. Not every individual astrobiologist is a fanatic believer, but it's a pervasive myth, and it goes like this. It is true. We have zero empirical knowledge that there is even microbial life on an off-Earth site, let alone intelligent life on an exoplanet. But the Milky Way is so big, maybe 400 billion stars with planets, right? 3, 5, 10 planets orbiting some stars. Some of those are Earth-like. There has just got to be people like us on those planets. The numbers are so big, and there may be 2 trillion galaxies, and imagine all of those galaxies with stars and planets, all right? Got to be life out there. All right, so that's premise number 1 of the ETI myth. Number 2, evolution. Oh, we all believe in evolution. Can't think about life without evolution. But suppose you slip in a second semi-individual premise into your understanding of evolution that says evolution is progressive. Evolution starts out simple, then over billions of years it gets more complex, and the more complex evolution gets, the more intelligent it gets. Wait a minute. Evolutionary biologists don't agree with that. There is no built-in principle of progress or advance in evolution. But the astrobiologists keep pressing this. And so you'll hear frequently in astrobiologists, Carl Sagan among others, that if an extraterrestrial civilization is 1 million years older than ours, or even more, it is more highly advanced. What? That's not scientific at all. But it sounds good, right? So if it's more advanced, then how will we recognize it? Well, because the sign of advancement is science and technology. So a more advanced civilization on another planet will have greater science and technology. After all, simple things that become complex become intelligent, and the most intelligent people on Earth that we know are who? The scientists. You see anything self-serving in that kind of myth? Well, then the scientists go ahead and say, we, the scientists, are the saviors of life on Earth. And those extraterrestrials who are 1 million years more advanced than us in science and technology, when we make contact with them, they will save us on Earth from self-destruction through nuclear war or environmental disaster. Isn't that a nice, handy myth? But it's believed by some pretty intelligent people. Christian de Duve, who is a Nobel Prize-winning biologist, Carl Sagan, one of the co-founders of SETI, Paul Davies, whom I just referenced, and then my good friend Charlie Towns, who passed away a couple of years ago, who was on the board of CTNS, an astrophysicist, and he was the chief scientist that helped put human beings on the moon in 1969 when he was at MIT. Here is Frank Drake, one of my favorite people. Unfortunately, he passed away this past October, and he was a longtime head of SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And here he is in an interview exhibiting the ETI myth. It goes like this. Everything we know says there are other civilizations out there to be found. Now, just note, we have zero empirical knowledge, right? All we have are big numbers. The discovery of such civilizations would enrich our civilization with valuable information about, look at the list, science, technology, and sociology. We're moving from science and technology into the human realm. This information could directly improve our abilities to conserve the ecological challenge, right? And to deal with sociological problems, poverty, for example. The ETIs are going to help us handle the poverty issue. Then there's cheap energy as another potential benefit of discovery as our advances in medicine. My gosh, those extraterrestrial scientists are going to advance our medical practices by leapfrogging. What's going on here? This is a secular eschatology based on the assumption that the advances in science and technology are salvific. Is the scientist practicing theology without a license? The astrotheologian, I think, needs to make this transparent. Let's go to NASA. I have a colleague there, Chris McKay, who's a Mars expert. And as we walk out of his office, there's this giant mural. I don't know if it's 8 feet long or whatever on the wall. Let's just take a look at it. Read it from left to right. That's over time. 4.5 billion years of the development of Earth. And you can see Earth in its formation on the left-hand side being bombarded by objects in space until the mass of the Earth is formed. It's very hot, volcanic in character, but eventually as it cools, we get the waters of the oceans. And then in the lower left-hand corner, you can see prebiotic molecules becoming biotic molecules, the development of DNA, worming its way through the hundreds of millions of years, and the DNA becoming simple life forms, then complex life forms, evolving in the sea, and then towards the right-hand corner now, sea creatures crawl up onto land and start breathing oxygen. We have the dinosaur era, and then we have the creation of the human race, Homo sapiens, and then Homo sapiens sapien. But evolution continues to go up and up and up, more and more complex, more and more intelligent. What is on the very top? What is at the apex? What is it that is at the point of heaven and earth connecting? See the green arrow? It's the observatory. The scientists are the peak of evolutionary development. They're the most intelligent, and they connect heaven with earth. Science and technology on earth matches the science and technology descending to earth from the skies. Well, if you know anything about the history of mythology, say Enuma Elish way back in ancient Babylonia, or the myths of creation amongst the ancient Egyptians, at the end, it is the king that gets crowned by the gods. So this is your science self-coronation epic. And so I stood there looking at this mural with some of my students and Chris McKay, and I said, Chris, are you crowned king of creation here? And he says, we know that evolution's really not progressive. That was all we went on. So I decided, I was invited actually to give a presentation at an astrobiology conference, and take a look at the section title in which my presentation appears. How can astrobiology help save the world? Who asked the astrobiologist to save the world? Is this a self-appointed office? So I just want to say that one task of the astrotheologian is just to remind the scientists they have not been asked to be saviors of the world. And they might actually be overstating their importance in trying to become the saviors of the world. I think that if the scientists would remain scientists, we would really be happy with what we learn about the natural world from the scientists. They don't need to practice theology without a license. Well, let's go on to the fourth task, astroethics. And here is Grace Wolf-Chase. If you've not met Grace, you're in for a treat. She's an astronomer in Chicago. And here's what she says. Although science can and arguably should inform ethics, science cannot dictate ethics. If science is genuinely a value-free discipline, then the scientist needs to work with non-scientists in formulating the values or the deontological principles of ethics. Science in itself is not licensed to do ethics. Let's just get clear on that. And let's proceed then with a number of ethical issues that have been formulated already with regard to space exploration. Top of the list is planetary protection. That is to say, if we were to discover an off-Earth microbial life form on Mars or a moon orbiting Saturn and bring it back to Earth, and our Earth-bound immunal systems are not prepared for it, it could do irrevocable damage. So we do need to have policies in place to protect ourselves. Could we then reverse this? Number two, intrinsic value. Do we have a moral responsibility to protect a biosphere that we might find on Mars or a moon of Saturn? Well, we need philosophers and maybe even theologians to help the scientific community understand what intrinsic value means and then how to formulate a policy that reflects that. At any rate, without going into detail, there are a long list of space research moral questions to which the astrotheologian, the astroethicist, along with a philosophical ethicist, could make a contribution. And I think the astrotheologian should assume that responsibility, not for the purpose of converting anybody to a religious point of view, but rather taking advantage of the long history of ethical deliberation which has taken place in the church and in other religious traditions, and seeing if it can contribute to the formulation of space research public policy. Here's an issue which popped up a couple of years ago. Suddenly, certain respected intellectuals on the planet said, stop sending messages to off-Earth civilizations. Stephen Hawking in England, for example, was saying, look, extraterrestrial civilizations might be hostile. They might have militaries, and if they find out we're here on Earth, they're going to come here, they're going to subdue Homo sapiens, and they're going to rape and pillage the planet. Stop sending messages. Well, at that point, within SETI, there was a movement for active SETI, not just listening for radio signals from off-Earth sites, but to actually send signals. Douglas Vakoch has begun METI messaging and has actually sent some messages to outer space. I actually serve on the board of METI, so you can tell what I think. This is a debatable issue. And are we making our planet vulnerable to hostile aggression by sending messages or not? I think the answer is no, but it is certainly an item that needs debate and consideration. Now let's turn for preparing for contact with extraterrestrial neighbors. Let's divide ET into three categories: less intelligent than you and I are, of equal intelligence to you and me, and superior intelligence. Why is intelligence the right category? I mean, as a Christian theologian, I think the most important thing is love. I hope ET is loving. But intelligence has been the concern in the scientific community all along. And so we have to respect that. And let's take a look now at Western civilization and the relationship of intelligence to your and my moral obligation. Immanuel Kant spoke for the whole Enlightenment, in which he said, a human person must be treated with dignity. That is to say, each human person must be treated as a moral end and not merely as a means to a further end. I'm really happy that most of the world has adopted Immanuel Kant's doctrine of human dignity. I really, really am. But relevant for this discussion is that Kant connected dignity with intelligence or rationality. It is the rational character of a human being that gives them a person demanding dignity. All right, let's just use that as a lens through which to interpret scenarios about meeting ET. Suppose we establish a communications relationship with a race of extraterrestrial intelligence who are inferior to us in intelligence. Do they deserve our treating them with dignity or not? What's comparable in our experience? Animals, right? Animals are intelligent. They're less intelligent than we are, but we have a schizophrenic relationship with animals. On the one hand, we kill them so that we can eat them. We create these large farms, actually factories, in which we grow animals under inhumane conditions, not to coin a pun, slaughter them and eat them. Clearly a means to an end. On the other hand, we have our pets. We love our pets. And if our pet has a medical emergency, we'll spend thousands of dollars at the veterinary hospital, right? The pet becomes an end in itself, not a means to an end. So how are we going to behave if we meet ETI who is like our pets? Well, pure ETI. Well, it's clear if ETI has a level of intelligence comparable to you and me, we're going to be morally mandated to treat them with dignity as an end. We might want to develop trade. We might want to develop friendship. And certainly in my church, we're going to invite ETI for a covered dish dinner in the church basement and make them feel at home with us. That's good. That's definitely going to happen. What if the ETI are superior to us intelligence? What if they're super intelligent? What if they're so intelligent that they treat us like animals, either slaughtering us for food or treating us as pets? Will we have to develop a slave morality on the grounds that they are our superiors? I know this doesn't sound very inviting to you and me, but when we take a look at the history of at least our own civilization, this is the kind of way it went. How should we think about this? There is a slave morality in the New Testament. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. Yucca-do. But notice the trap that we have put ourselves in our civilization by emphasizing that intelligence and rationality is the criterion by which we measure human difference. What if we find ourselves on the low end of the intelligence ladder? Well, I think the astrotheologian and the astroethicist need to start thinking about these things, speculative though they may be. Okay, finally, in conclusion, should we Christians worry that our faith will collapse if we suddenly find ourselves in the company of extraterrestrial neighbors? My answer is no. And I think that's going to be the case for people of other non-Christian religious traditions as well, at least if the survey has any level of accuracy. Should we believe in the ETI myth or the UFO myth that somehow or other more scientifically and technologically advanced extraterrestrial civilizations will come to Earth and save us from nuclear war, from planetary collapse due to bad ecological policies? Should we believe those myths? No. We have a moral obligation for world peace and planetary health, and don't expect technological angels from the sky to save us. Should we affirm solid science rather than mythological thinking? Yes, indeed. Ask our scientists to stick to the science and don't try to do mythology without a license. Multiple incarnations. How will the second person of the Trinity manifest the divine in off-earth sites? I don't know. Wouldn't surprise me if it's multiple incarnations, but I tend to think that the forgiveness of sins and the promise of resurrection in Jesus Christ is probably God's work effective throughout the cosmos and not on Earth alone. The only way we're going to find out for sure, of course, is ask God in the resurrection. So those are my thoughts about astrotheology, reflections on astrobiology. Bye-bye.
That was incredible, Ted. Thank you for that presentation. Today, for our question-answer period, we have two moderators. The first is our very own administrative assistant, Sheila Roth, who will direct questions to Ted Peters, and Dr. Cynthia Tulin-Wilson, who will direct questions to Paul Segura. We'll begin with Dr. Cynthia Tulin-Wilson.
Paul, well done. And one of the questions that Deacon John Minneke asked is, what do you think was different about the country then that enabled astronauts to circle the moon less than 8 years after the challenge had been made?
Okay, well, thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, Deacon John, for that question. Yeah, I think that the world in 1968, in many respects, is different, right, than the world is now, of course. But also very different in terms of what the world had been beforehand as well. One thought that pops in my mind is that in the mid 1960s, right, was the same time frame that the Second Vatican Council was called and took place, right? So in that world, right, there was already this sense of opening up, right, and ensuring that we can take this beautiful treasure, the deposit of faith, and how do we engage that to the world, the modern world, right? Mm-hmm. And that conversation obviously was taking place in that time frame in the 1960s. Now, of course, by the time this mission took place, I believe, right, the council had actually closed, right, but they were beginning the process of promulgating all of that. So from a faith perspective, right, there's a lot of openness, right, and a sense of what is the future going to be bringing to us. So that's the case. And I would say that in a similar way, the space program was doing that same kind of impact, I'd say, to the wider world from a secular perspective. That the world that had existed up until the beginning of the space race and the space program had its assumptions about the world, assumptions about life, assumptions about deeper questions. Okay. And as the missions were taking place, as the 1960s unfolded, and more things were accomplished, first of all, by sending people into space in the first place, which many people, I shouldn't say many people, but there are a lot of people who thought that was an impossible thing to do. It wasn't even possible to go into space. And the fact that people were going into space, okay, right at the very beginning of the 1960s was already a major paradigm shift for some people. So how far could we go was an open question. How long could people survive in space was an open question. So one by one, these questions were getting answered, and previous barriers in some people's minds that were considered insurmountable collapsed. Okay, and so when Apollo 8 took place, a number of things had to take place to lead up to that mission that already opened up possibilities and things like that. I think that just set the stage for what would happen on Apollo 8 for making such a long leap. Before Apollo 8, the farthest anybody had been from Earth was 850 miles.
Wow.
Okay, which is far away, but still,
but not anything like that.
The moon is 240,000 miles.
Yeah.
So significantly farther away. Many people just feared for this crew.
Yeah.
There's so many the things that could go wrong on this crew were many. On this mission were many.
Right.
Those things didn't go wrong, and from an engineering and science perspective, we can say that they didn't go wrong because they were well prepared, and they weren't as prepared as they could have been because they had a shortened time frame, but yet they were prepared enough that it didn't go wrong. But we can also from a faith perspective that this was the fullness of time for this to happen.
Yeah,
and it did.
Yeah. Just the reaction to the Genesis reading points to that.
Yes,
it really that to me was very touching.
Yes.
To hear something like this being quoted, and here we are, not even on the planet. It was just very, very touching. And
yes, yeah, absolutely. And for me, this is being read by people who are obviously very strong in their belief in science, very determined in terms of their assigned mission as military men. Of course, they're faithful people. In addition to that, right? Yes. But people's perception of them is that these are fighter pilots, they're astronauts. These aren't, quote, holy kind of people. Yet these are the ones who were reading these scripture passages. Yeah, they chose to read these scripture passages. So that for me is good.
Yeah, that is significant. There really isn't a clash, necessarily a clash, I should say, between faith and science. But so many people see it as, a major issue.
Yes.
So that's that they couldn't have chosen a better reading.
Amen.
Well, thank you, Ted, for the excellent presentation. We have a number of questions for you from our audience. The first one is from Paul Segura. He said, that was excellent, Ted. When and where did astrotheology first surface, and are there degree programs in this field?
In the 1970s, when Carl Sagan and Frank Drake and others were warming up to this field, the scientists called it exobiology, biology off Earth. It was in the mid-1990s that the scientists elected the term astrobiology. And I think that what motivated that was to study both the evolution of life on Earth as well as speculate about the evolution of life on other planets. Be that as it may, the dominant scientific word for a quarter of a century now has been astrobiology. Those of us who were pioneering this in the 70s and 80s, we experimented with the term exotheology. You'll still find it today. But in the last decade or so, we've shifted to astrobiology simply because we want that interaction with the scientists. And by the way, for the most part, the interaction has really been healthy and vibrant over the last 15 years or so. With regard to doctoral programs, yes, there are a number of them for the scientists in astrobiology and related scientific fields. With regard to theology, no. We do a little bit of it here in Berkeley at our Center for Theology and Natural Sciences. Ilya Delio at Villanova, I think, has at least one student doing a doctorate that includes astrotheology within that, but no, I don't think it's a widespread discipline as of yet.
Okay. Maybe in the future.
Maybe in the future.
Right.
Okay, the next question is, did any other flights to the moon go without a lunar module?
No. All the other flights to the moon. So the next flight to the moon was Apollo 10. Mm-hmm. And that was the flight that was going to test with the lunar module. They didn't land, but they did test flying. They flew down towards the moon, but stayed at altitude and then returned to orbit. So all the rest of the Apollo missions did have a lunar module.
Here's another question. This one's from Sebastian. He says, is it possible that only Earth experienced the fall? Would Adam's sin affect the whole cosmos?
My answer is going to be no, but I think it's a good question. Certainly C.S. Lewis, when he wrote his space trilogy, which included Perelandra, among others, he thought that it would be possible for another planet, Mars or Venus, to have escaped the fall. And then when Earthlings go there, we carry the contamination of the fall with us. I think that was his sense of, C.S. Lewis's sense of humor. I tend to say no, because along with my colleague Bob Russell here in Berkeley, we see the physical dimensions of the fall into sin. It's not strictly a spiritual, non-physical thing, sin. But as that spiritual tradition of the flesh versus the spirit reveals, you and I are subject to temptations that come to us from our embodied situation. I think eating is the basic one, right? The predator-prey relationship accounts for the vast majority of violent activity in both the animal world and in the human world. And I think that human sinful behavior is integrated with all that physicality. And the best that you and I could do, even as in our sanctified life, is to appreciate the sacrifices of plants and animals for our well-being. So I think the whole creation has fallen. But let me tell you that if an alien were to show up and not be fallen into sin, I would be really, really grateful.
That would be something.
And then there's the question, what happened to the Russian moon rocket?
So it was early in 1969 where that moon rocket, the N1, Soviet N1 moon rocket, suffered a massive explosion during one of its attempted test flights. that completely destroyed the rocket, severely damaged the launch pad and then a lot of the facilities at Baikonur, the Soviet launch facility, that even if they were really, truly aiming for the moon, there would be no way they would have been able to repair all of that, recover all of that, build another rocket before we would have been ready to go to the moon. So, getting news of that massive explosion, which again came through intelligence at the time, kind of gave NASA a little bit of schedule relief. But what kept up with the schedule, just, again, intelligence only tells you so much. Did they really not have another rocket ready? Would they have another rocket? Do they have another launch pad perhaps? They didn't know about it, right? Who knows, right? So NASA was still always ready. So it wasn't until after the end of the Cold War when the Russians released a lot of this information to the public. And it turns out that they were planning on going to the moon, but they weren't near ready. They weren't near ready. They were trying to give the impression that they were very close to where we were, or if not ahead of where we were, but in reality, they weren't anywhere close at all.
Okay.
So after that big explosion, the Russians secretly kind of canceled that whole mission, but didn't tell anybody they were canceling the mission. They made it sound like they were still aiming to go to the moon, but they stopped.
I have a question here from Grace Wolf Chase, who you mentioned earlier. She says, another myth is the assumption, quote unquote myth, is the assumption that we will actually be able to discern and communicate with ETI if we do discover it. The assumption is that science, as we practice it, will provide a universal language. Can you comment on this as a theologian?
On the one hand, the hermeneutical philosophers are going to tell us that initial communication with ETI is going to be really, really tough. However, I'm optimistic. Hans-Georg Gadamer, a philosopher whom I greatly admire at the University of Heidelberg, said, you start with conflicting horizons, and eventually these horizons fuse. And I love the movie Arrival, which takes up precisely this issue where the aliens think cyclically and the earthlings think linearly, but over time they're able to fuse the horizons. So I'm optimistic that we will be able to share understanding once contact is established. But Grace Wolf Chase's question has another element in it. Will science, she asks, be the key? And I think the answer is probably going to be yes. And it goes back to our own Western tradition. When science was born in Western Europe with Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo and Newton, they inherited from the medieval theologians the belief that God thinks rationally, and if the scientist thinks rationally, the scientist will actually have a mind attuned with the divine, and quite specifically, rationality, the rationality focuses on mathematics. Mathematics is the most rational of all trains of thought. And what has amazed scientists right down to the present day is that whenever they analyze the natural world, it is the language of mathematics that reveals the truths of nature. God thinks mathematically, said Arthur Peacock at Oxford. You and I think mathematically. The best theologians in the world are going to be the mathematicians, etc. And there is a principle, the cosmological principle, that says the following, that any physical object in the universe, even if it be 11 billion light years away, operates according to the same mathematical principles that obtain here on Earth. If that's true, then Grace Wolf Chase's surmise would obtain, namely, yeah, we could communicate with those extraterrestrials. We just asked the mathematicians to be our interpreters.
Right. Okay. Good solution.
And what's happened now to the American space program?
So originally, let's see. So Apollo 11 was the first attempt to land on the moon, which they successfully did, obviously, as history tells us. They had lunar landings planned all the way through Apollo 20. Okay, so they had multiple landings on the moon. We said, well, instead of just landing on the moon and saying we're just all done, now that we've gotten this capability, let's learn as much about the moon as we possibly can, and do a lot with the moon as we possibly can while we have the opportunity to get to the moon. So they have multiple missions planned to the moon, to land at different locations on the near side of the moon to learn more about that. And Apollo 15 was the first mission where they landed on the moon with an actual vehicle called the lunar rover, where they could drive around the moon. They could go further away from their landing site than just walking, right? So, and it was on that mission that what has been nicknamed the Genesis rock was discovered. This rock, and geologists had two theories about the moon. Either the moon was a body that formed separately, but about the same time as the Earth, or the moon was a body that was captured into Earth orbit, or that the moon was formed from the Earth itself, either due to a collision with another body or some other means. And this Genesis rock helped kind of confirm that, because the Genesis rock was of a material that is from Earth. It's the oldest rock that was discovered during the lunar missions, and one of the oldest rocks ever discovered. They found this one just laying on the surface of the moon. They picked it up. The astronauts were trained to look for certain kinds of rocks, and they turned it back to Earth. And this rock is 4 billion years old.
Wow.
The Earth itself is 4 billion years old. Most rocks on Earth disappear due to volcanic action and weather and all this. Whereas on the moon, this stuff has just been laying there for billions of years.
4 billion years. Wow.
So the last mission on the moon was Apollo 17. The Congress canceled the rest of it because national priorities shifted. We landed on the moon, and then people said, the public, right? Well, we've done it. We're done. We've met President Kennedy's goal, so why are we wasting all this money still going to the moon? So those missions were cut, right? So NASA had to focus on other things, and they started focusing on space stations, the space shuttle program, and it was only in more recent years that the decision was made to return to the moon.
Good.
And as I mentioned earlier, last December, the Artemis 1 mission was launched, and Artemis is the successor of Apollo. The name Artemis is the sister of Apollo, right? In Greek mythology. So they named the current lunar program Artemis. And that rocket was a test, no astronauts, but they did send a capsule to the moon to see if everything was working properly, return it to Earth. That all went successfully. So we are returning to the moon after half a century. we are returning.
That's good, because we'll be able to learn so much more.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the plan is not to just land and stay a short time. The plan is to land and stay and to build habitats to help us learn how to live on a different body, so that when we go to Mars, we have a lot of those lessons learned. Instead of learning those lessons millions of miles away, we learn those lessons only hundreds of thousands of miles away.
Yeah. Do we plan on going to Mars?
There is a plan to go to Mars.
Oh, that's wonderful. I hope I live long enough to see it.
I hope so too. They keep saying it, and they keep stretching out because it's so hard to get them. I mean, it's at best it's a multi-month mission to get to Mars. over a year in a lot of cases. So, but that is the plan.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's really something. I would love to be alive to hear about that. And then just think of all the other planets we can go to. It's wonderful.
Yes.
Yes. God really gave us a good intellect and a strong will.
Oh, amen.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So made in his image and likeness.
Yes.
Yes. That's the theologian in me. I always interpret everything theologically.
I love it. We need more of that.
Okay.
All right. We have another question from Sebastian. He says, our media that depict a human encounter with ETI are either dystopic, like War of the Worlds, or somewhat utopic, like Star Trek. How do you think popular media prepare us for the ETI encounter when or if it comes?
First of all, the popular media probably dominates our consciousness. And the survey that said that self-identified religious people will not face a religious crisis if ETI is confirmed, I think they're dominated by the media. I don't think it was their religious tradition particularly that led to those responses. My kids all grew up with aliens as part of their worldview. So there are very few surprises left. Now, this difference between utopia and dystopia, I think, is very important. My observation has been that the dystopian scenarios come from fiction, especially science fiction. The utopian scenarios are much more serious. When it comes to the UFO phenomenon, there are only two really authentic UFO movies. In 1951, The Day the Earth Stood Still, and 1977, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Both of these movies fit on what experiencers tell us about their encounters with aliens in flying saucers and UFOs, that the aliens come from a more advanced civilization that has learned to live in peace. And not only that, they have great spiritual values that we want to emulate. And so their coming here is going to bring peace on Earth, or at least teaching us about how we on Earth can obtain peace. That is the ETI myth in the UFO form. But most movies export the tensions between Republicans and Democrats, or between the United States and the Soviet Union, export those and make those the themes of intergalactic encounter. So in some, Sebastian, I think the dystopian scenario comes from fiction, and the utopian comes from what the experiencers want to tell us.
Very good. Interesting.
Anyway, the last question. I've heard about a new rocket that recently flew to the moon. Could you tell us anything about that?
Yes. So that is that Artemis rocket that did fly. And as I mentioned during the talk, it is the rocket that has at last dethroned the Saturn V as being the largest, most powerful rocket ever built. Saturn V was 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff.
Wow.
Artemis is I think it's about 9 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. So it's definitely a more powerful rocket. But it's needed because we're going to be bringing a lot of things to the moon now. It's not just bringing people to land. It's beyond that. We want to build habitats and vehicles. And they're concentrating on the south pole of the moon because we think water has been discovered in the south pole of the moon, frozen ice. The south pole of the moon, by the nature of how the moon orbits, is never in sunlight. So it's always ice there. So the thought is let's confirm that there's ice and see if we can mine that ice and take advantage of that.
Wow. That's great.
Okay. We have one last question, and this one is from Jeff. He says, have we not anthropomorphized God? Let us make man in our image. Reversing that, God looks like us. Perhaps God looks more like a little green man, or more likely, perhaps God looks like every intelligent creature in the universe and has presented himself uniquely to all. Any comments on that?
Well, we certainly do anthropomorphize God. That is to say, even though we have the commandment, either number 1 or 2, depending on how you number them, that we should not create a graven image. We should not create mental images either. C.S. Lewis said that when he was a kid, his mother said, whatever you do, son, don't think about God in an image. And so C.S. Lewis sat down to think about God without having images, and God came out looking like a great massive sea of gray tapioca. So it's impossible for the human mind not to project images of the invisible God. So for the Christian, God went and did it for us. We have the baby Jesus in the manger. We have Jesus the teacher. We have Jesus the crucified. We have Jesus the risen one. And these become icons in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, icons which are a concrete image, but windows that open us to the splendor of the divine that cannot be imaged. So we always, as Christians, have this tension between the images we create and then the transcendent God who judges those particular images. The little green men illusion, let me just alter that a little bit. Could aliens coming to us in flying saucers be technological angels? We certainly have experienced on Earth the wonders of technology, and just think about medicine. The technology that helps us to live longer and be healthier is absolutely wonderful. So couldn't a heavenly technology be doing the work that angels used to do? I think that is a trope that is working its way through our culture. And the ETI myth, even though it's promulgated by very smart people, is really a form of anthropological projection that we like our scientists on Earth, so we imagine this great extraterrestrial scientist who's more intelligent, more advanced, is coming back to help us. Is that a projection mechanism? Well, you bet you in spades it's a projection mechanism. But I don't really expect you and I or our neighbors to get along without some kind of projection device going on. It's just we need to think about our projections critically, recognizing that God is going to transcend even our most complex images of the divine.
Right. Very good.
Okay, I have one more question. What may be the impact of the newest military branch, Space Force, in future moon exploration and colonization?
Okay, wow, that is a really good question. So the United States Space Force is of course our newest branch of the military. Mm-hmm. Right, and it was formed out of the Air Force. It's still in the Department of the Air Force, right? But it is its own separate service. Its main focus is to be responsible for military doctrine, strategy, and military assets that are in space. So a lot of that today is satellites today. There are a lot of military satellites that are responsible for reconnaissance, like the intelligence I spoke about, okay, in this talk. some of those photographs are taken by military satellites, reconnaissance photos, right, of different sites around the world. Now, of course, there are other government agencies that also have those kinds of satellites, but the Space Force is among them. Okay, the Space Force is also responsible for all of the GPS satellites. Okay,
Really?
so the GPS network was originally built as a military network. It still is a military network, but as a goodwill, okay, they've opened up GPS for anybody to use for free. Okay. Now the version that we all use, okay, today on our maps and smartphones, and all that is the I'll call it the civilian version of that. Yeah. There's a military version GPS that's a lot more you can do with that. So that's one of the major responsibilities of the Space Force to maintain those satellites, to launch new satellites. Okay, as these, in fact, they're in the midst of replenishing GPS satellites, because the original GPS satellites have been up there now for almost 3 decades.
Wow.
It's a long time. So, because that's now, decades old technology. So we have newer satellites, and those satellites are running out of fuel, parts, dying on it.
Sure.
So we have to take care of all that. I think sometimes there's a misperception that the Space Force is designed to be kind of like Star Trek. Talking about Will Shatner earlier. That we'll be sending armed soldiers up into space. And maybe in the future might get to that. I don't know. But what they're responsible for is assets in space. So the moon, okay. So the moon, by treaty, 1967 space treaty, is neutral territory.
Good.
Right. So yeah, we planted our flag on the moon, but that doesn't mean that we've claimed the moon as American territory. It just means that we've been there. Right. Yeah. So as we start building these structures on the moon for long-term missions, right, to stay on the moon, to live and work on the moon, to prepare us to go to Mars, okay, we're going to have to start answering questions as to, okay, well then, how do we interact with other countries? Because other countries are planning missions to the moon. The Chinese are planning missions to the moon. Okay, the Russians want to eventually get back to the moon. Okay, and private companies, we talked about earlier, are wanting to eventually send people to the moon themselves. So it's getting more crowded on the moon. So we need to come up with a means to say, how do we interact? What are going to be the rules of the road for people on the moon? Okay. And so as our facilities on the moon become more permanent, okay, will they need to be protected? Well, probably. Okay. Yeah. Well, will that be the responsibility of the Space Force? It's not yet, but it would make sense, for them. Or would it mean that the Army and the Marine Corps will have to have their own space elements? Maybe, don't know. But the fact that the government has recognized that space has become of an importance, that its own branch of service needs to be there so we can focus on it a lot, right? Because for forever, it was a part of the Air Force, right? Yeah. And one of the issues that led to the Space Force was that space was a small part of the Air Force compared to the rest of the Air Force.
Sure. Okay?
And whenever it came to priority, budget, planning, everything else, space always seemed to be kind of on the side. Where all the airplane people, got all the attention, right? And a space person never became the head of the Air Force. It was always airplane people, as an example. So the thought was, well, if it was his own service, it could speak for itself. And plan for itself, which is why the Space Force came into being. The same reason why the Air Force became its own branch of the service and separated itself from the Army. Same story, right? Yeah. The Air Force felt like they were, the stepchild of the Army, but they only cared about their big guns and tanks. They don't care about everything. and they became their own service. So it's like history, as Scott Hahn has said, he's quoting somebody else, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme, right?
Mm-hmm. That's true. Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully we won't need the Space Force to protect us from aliens.
Hopefully not. I hope the aliens are friendly.
That's what I'm concerned about. I believe that God is he's not just the creator, he's the prolific creator. When you look at our planet, and it's like, I just have trouble believing, and I hope I'm not stepping on dogma here, but I just have trouble believing that he did this on the earth and then he retired. I mean, it's like, is he not still creating in other parts of the universe or other universes? So he's so prolific. Why would he just limit himself? Absolutely. Yeah.
I think it was Benedict XVI. This wasn't a formal encyclical or anything, but there was something that he wrote, or he was addressing some group at the Vatican. It may have been a scientific group he was addressing, but he spoke about openness to life in other places. That there's nothing that says that couldn't be part of the unfolding of creation.
Well, what we have to hope for is they don't have original sin. Right. If they don't, we'll be in a much better place.
We don't need another alien civilization to show up and start sharing their problems with us. We have enough of problems.
That's true.
All right, that wraps up our Q&A. Thank you, everyone, for your participation in this webinar. Thank you especially to Paul Segura and Ted Peters for your excellent presentations. For our closing prayer, I am delighted to share with you the 2-minute clip broadcast from the Apollo 8 mission on December 24th, 1968, by Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.